So after several months of leaks and patent applications that have been seen on the news, what we have here is a final release version of Campagnolo's new Ekar group set. Now this, for an overview, this is a 1x13 group set aimed at gravel bikes or adventure road bikes. So it has been released now as a 1x13. On the front you've got options of 4 different chainring sizes from 38, 40, 42 and 44. On the back got 3 cassette options, including 9 to 42 as featured here. Then there's also a 9 to 36 and a 10 to 44. If you take this cassette as an example, it's got a range of 300 or approximately 360%, which gives it a really big range. It's not quite as big as a SRAM Axis mullet setup, which I think is 400%, a 10 to a 50 tooth. But for that you need wireless Axis. To compare it to Shimano GRX with an 1142, I think that's about 290%. For a mechanical group set, this has got a really big range. So key to the group set is this cassette, 13-speed cassette. This specific one, 9 to 42, and that 9 tooth is key to being able to allow other things to be possible on the group set. For this to be possible, Campagnolo are using a new, what they call N3W, so a new free hub body. It is 4.4 millimeters shorter than the original, but there is an adapter available. They're making an adapter available for you to be able to use a normal or a more standard 11-speed, 12-speed Campagnolo cassette. One thing that's really interesting about the cassette is if you look closely at the sprockets, some of them almost look as if they're missing a tooth. They're tiny little spurs, and this is in theory to improve shifting. They are more evident on the lower cassette, which have smaller gaps than the bigger cassette, which have the larger gaps. Another feature of the cassette is it's effectively 2 parts. Now, I mean that in 2 ways. First of all, it is a 2-piece body, but it feels like when you're riding that there are 2 parts to the cassette. This lower part starts at 9, and then on this specific one goes 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So all of those are 1 tooth increments. From there, it starts jumping up. So you've got 14, 16, I think then it goes 19, and then the gaps start to increase. When you're out riding on flatter, faster ground and road, those smaller gaps feel absolutely fantastic. There's no gaps. You don't feel as if you're missing a gear somewhere. And if you're the type of rider who is taking their gravel bike on the road to get off-road, or you do a lot of mixed terrain on this type of bike, I guarantee you that this will feel really good. Compare that to something, the other extreme would be comparing it to the mullet setup. That has big wide spacing throughout the cassette, and there you can feel at certain times that there are gaps. On the taller side of the cassette, on the smaller gears, the gaps are bigger, but what I've found so far, at least, it's only initial riding and only two rides so far, is that the gaps are not as noticeable as you might expect. I think this is because you tend to be going slower, the cadence tends to be lower, and when you're going up, it doesn't feel, so far at least, as if there are any huge gaps in the ratios. So if we look down to the derailleur, there are a few new features for Campagnolo on this. So this is the first time that Campagnolo have produced an off-road group set since the late 80s and early 90s, and it's the first time that they've produced a derailleur with a clutch. This clutch seems to work really well, and it's really strong. I've not noticed, even when you're in the 9 tooth on the back, that there's much movement in the chain, so that seems as if it's really strong. There is also a clutch holder for when you're taking the wheel off and on. It is a little bit fiddly so far. It's a tiny little catch here, and I haven't had a chance to really look in depth at it, but it does seem a little bit more fiddly than SRAM, for instance. Other things to note on the rear derailleur: there is an oversized bottom pulley wheel and a slightly smaller top pulley wheel. I think that is again also to aid shifting. And what's really interesting is they've got what they're calling 2D parallelogram. Quite a bit of a mouthful. So I'm going to attempt to explain what Campagnolo mean by the 2D parallelogram system that they've got with this pipe cleaner. So imagine this being a standard or another system, effectively the pulley wheels will move in a linear fashion like that. So as you can see, that there's a big gap here in the middle. So the B tension screw, which controls how low this sits, will mean that top pulley wheel will be a lot lower or a lot further away from these gears than it will be from this one and the shorter ones. This system allows effectively it to follow the gears as it goes, so you get a curve, and it should mean that the rear derailleur sits really close on all the shifts. When you put this in a work stand, you can see this really clearly, and it does seem to work really well. On the road, it also seems to make a difference. The shifts are quite clean and crisp. So moving from the rear derailleur up to the front. So this is very similar in style to other Campagnolo carbon chain sets. This is available in a 38 to a 44. This one I've got fitted here is a 38. And they claim it's very light, and they've also managed to keep the Q factor really low. Now, for GRX, the Q factor increased, and that was to allow clearance and bigger tyres to be possible on certain frames. What I think is, because this is only available up to a 44, by having a smaller chainring, which is possible because of the 9-tooth on the back, it means that you're able to keep the Q factor, and still frames should be able to fit and get the extra tyre clearance. So by having that 9-tooth, that has an extra benefit on the front. Overall, the gearing, I would say that is one thing that I'm not completely convinced about yet, as it is early days. For me and the riding I've done so far, it's been fine, but I think specifically if you were to do some slower riding, some bike packing, anything that's got some really slower riding, you might struggle with the gearing on offer. The smallest gear on this setup is a 38 to a 42, and the smallest possible is a 44 on the back. And I'm not sure if that's going to suit all riders. My instinct is it probably won't, but I haven't had a chance to test it yet. Moving up to the levers, these Ergo Power levers, I think these will be familiar to anyone who knows or already uses Campagnolo group sets. The hoods are very similar shape, and it will be personal. I really like the shape. I find that it's more comfortable than Shimano or SRAM. One big difference though is the lever here on the inside. Now, Campagnolo are known for having this thumb shifter, but this, what they're calling the lever 3, is dramatic change. It is a much different shape, and it makes shifting from the drops a lot more easier. Especially for me, I find it is easier to reach. I don't know if anyone else might have had the same problems on previous ones, but on old Campagnolo or on other iterations of Campagnolo group sets, it's quite a stretch with your thumb to reach it when you're in the drops. This is much better. I really like it. From the drops or the hoods, it is really easy to use. The upshift lever is just behind the brake lever, as with most other group sets. It's really nice as well to use, and that you can change up to 3 upshifts in one movement. The lever shape is really nice as well. When you're on the drops, there's a nice feel to that. It makes one finger braking quite possible, and the shape here in the hoods just makes it very comfortable. One slight downside is if you are used to holding it sort of halfway down here, then you do lose that position compared to SRAM or Shimano. But overall, the comfort's there, and I've found so far I get used to that position really quickly. One slight thing, if I was being really picky, is underneath here, because of the way that this lever 3 works, there are a couple of little indentations. I would have liked to have seen that matched exactly on the other side, just because when I'm riding, I find a finger fits in that quite nicely, and just to keep it feeling exactly the same, even though it would do nothing, it would be nice to have the same on that side. So one big factor for people is going to be the shift quality of the system. Now, if you were to directly compare this to Shimano GRX, for example, I would say that this has a crisper and a more positive shift, especially on the downshift. There's a definite click, but even so on the upshift, there's 1, 2, 3. Now, Shimano, that's it's not as definite, it's not as positive, but the downside of this system is it is a little bit noisier. The shifting is quite smooth, or smoother than I was expecting. Not quite as smooth as Shimano, but it is noisier. That's probably the biggest downside, is it is quite noisy when it's shifting. The shifting stays pretty consistent throughout the range of the cassette. So what you might expect it to be not so good on the top, but actually it feels very similar. When it was in the work stand, when I first got the bike, I wasn't so convinced, but out on the road it seems to even out, and it seems really fine when you're riding. So it is early days. You might see if a lot of time, a lot of distance on the bike, if that changes at all. But initial impressions, the shifting quality seems very good. Moving down to the brakes, these are not dramatically different to other Campagnolo brakes or disc brakes that I'm aware of. There are no new features that they're claiming for these. That's no bad thing, I'll say. They work really well. There's plenty of modulation, plenty of power. The feel from the brakes is really good, and that's one really big plus for Campagnolo on the disc brakes. So there's naturally going to be comparisons made to other group sets out there, specifically Shimano GRX and SRAM 1 and SRAM Axis. I've only had 2 rides on this so far, one longer ride, one varied ride yesterday, and a shorter ride today, so it is very early days. What I would say is, so far, the range on offer for this setup with these chainring sizes I find really good. I find it offers something that others don't, and that I really like. There are a couple of things that I'm not sure about yet, and I say the range on the gearing is one thing I would say. I'm not yet sure about durability, although Campagnolo have claimed that is one thing that they've really focused on. Now, the other thing that they've also said, that this is the lightest gravel group set that you can get. Now, that really, I don't think will be a focus for many people, but if it is, this does seem really light. I haven't taken any parts off to independently weigh it, but as a whole, this bike is very light, and that does help when you're going up hills, obviously. So I'm hoping over the course of the next few weeks to put in a lot of distance on this, really test it out. Got a lot of good riding potential here in Wales, and as we're getting into autumn, the bad weather is going to be coming, to really test wet weather of this. But from a really early initial viewpoint, I would say this is quite positive. Price point is always going to be tricky. Campagnolo have always seems to have had a premium on other brands. Whether that makes it worth it, that is ultimately an independent, something that you can only decide yourself. But this does seem to have some features that others don't have, which for some people, and especially if you're already a Campagnolo fan, then you would find this be really good.